Hello everybody, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Chris and I'm an interpreter at NATO and I speak very fast. So I shall make a huge effort to slow down. My wife told me I had to speak as if I was preaching at church, which I also do. So good luck. The trouble is the more excited I get, the faster I speak. I'm actually speaking extremely slowly now by my own standards. Anyway, I wanted to talk to you tonight about my experience as an ambulance paramedic in Belgium. I've been living here in Belgium 25 years, and for 20 of those years I've been working as a volunteer ambulance paramedic, which is a lot of fun. It's also extremely interesting and challenging as a pastime. How did I start? Well, what happened one day, I was at NATO and I was working, and my colleague who had been abroad, I think in the States, she had to be repatriated because she broke her leg. She was skiing, that's right, I remember now. And she told me that she'd been brought back in an air ambulance by her insurance company because, by the way, opening a parenthesis, we have very good health insurance at NATO. I recommend it. Anyway, let me close the parenthesis and say she had been brought back in an air ambulance provided by our insurers. And she said, well, it was really good. They came to meet me at the airport, there was an ambulance, and they drove me back home in the ambulance. I said, that's really interesting. She said, do you know what? I said, no. Well, she said, the ambulance paramedics were volunteers. I said, really? That sounds extremely interesting, because I like doing volunteer stuff. That, by the way, to open another parenthesis, is a very good part of being an interpreter. You can actually volunteer for NGOs, which I do a lot of, and that's fun too. Close my second parenthesis. To come back to the ambulance paramedic stuff, so I rang up the Red Cross. I said, well, is it true that you can be an ambulance paramedic and you can be a volunteer? And they said, yes, you can, as long as you have what the French call a brevet de secourisme. You have a first aid training certificate. I said, as it happens, I was in the police in the UK, which is true, by the way. This is my third parenthesis. I was a policeman for 10 years in the UK before becoming an interpreter. And I can extend this third parenthesis by saying that I am the only person I've ever met who has been a policeman and an interpreter. There aren't any others that I know of, but there may be some somewhere. Closing my third parenthesis. And so I had a first aid qualification. So I turned up one day, I remember my first day, I turned up at the headquarters of the Red Cross, which was in the Chaussée de Vergat in those days. That was where the ambulance station was. And I was so naive and so green around the gills, as we say in English, that Jackie, who was the brigadier who was in charge of that particular shift at the Red Cross, he said, c'est chouette, on va faire du sang. And so I said, great, wonderful. I thought he meant we're transporting blood, but he didn't actually mean that. What he meant was that we were doing le sang, as you know, being the emergency call number in Belgium, like 999 in the UK or 911 in the USA. You can also use 112, by the way, 112 being the European emergency call number. Anyway, so I thought we were going to be going transporting blood, and it turned out that we were actually going to all the stressful emergency calls during that particular shift. I should point out before going any further that in Belgium it's a particular system. The ambulances are run, the emergency ambulances that do the emergency work and respond to emergency calls are run jointly by the Red Cross and by the fire service. The fire service mans about 60% of the ambulances, and the other 40% are manned by the Red Cross. There's a contract between the Belgian state and the Red Cross. And most of the Red Cross ambulance paramedics are volunteers. I would say about 2/3 of them, 1/3 being salaried staff who are permanent employees of the Red Cross. Anyway, the thing was that what they hadn't told me was that if you have a first aid certificate, that doesn't get you very far, because knowing first aid is obviously extremely useful, but it's not really going to equip you to save people's lives in all sorts of extreme and bizarre circumstances, which is what you encounter as an ambulance paramedic. So I decided that I would qualify further, and I went to night school for 4 years. It was, I think, 1 evening a week and 2 Saturdays a month. So something like about 30 hours a month of training provided by the Red Cross and by the fire service to get what the French call my brevet AMU. AMU in French meaning, as you know, aide médicale urgente, as the English say, emergency medical care. And so after my 3 years of night school, I had my AMU badge, which I still have, by the way. And that qualified me to actually be not simply a driver of an ambulance, but to be a proper paramedic. In the UK, for example, the training takes a lot longer than that because in the UK the paramedics are qualified to carry out certain medical acts that a Belgian paramedic can't carry out, like intubation. Intubation, which you know about, I'm sure, is putting in a tube in the esophagus or in the airways to help somebody breathe who is not breathing autonomously. Anyway, intubation is carried out by British paramedics and American ones as well, but not by Belgian paramedics who aren't qualified to the same standard. So, to come back, how did it actually work? What I used to do was work a 12-hour shift every Wednesday night. It was rather knackering, as we say in English, because I'd do a full day work at NATO in the booth, and then I'd go to the Red Cross station, and I'd work from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. once a week. I did it on Wednesdays. And it was extremely exciting. It was a bit scary, because if you do it once a week, it's rather like interpreting. You're not as good as if you do it every day. So every week was quite a challenge. I'd sit there thinking, oh my God, what's the next call going to be about? And of course, you sit there and the phone would ring and you'd leap. You wouldn't go down a greasy pole like in the films. That's more in America. But you'd run out, literally you'd run to your ambulance and you start whizzing off with your siren on and your blue lights going, and you'd go to wherever the problem was. You always worked as a binôme, two people, one driving, one passengering, and you take it in turns to drive or to be the passenger. We were obviously all by that stage qualified with the proper emergency medical care qualification, or license probably in English. I did all this in French, so I'm not quite sure how to say it all in English. And that leads me to my fourth parenthesis. My fourth parenthesis is that in talking about this stuff tonight in English, I realise why all the French delegates at NATO prefer to speak English, because they actually work in English all the time, which means all the terms they know are in English. And trying to transpose them all into French, even if French is their mother tongue, is not easy. I'm having the same problem tonight. I'm having to translate everything from my head back from the French I learned it in into English and hope it's correct English. That's the end of my fourth parenthesis. Anyway, so I would do this night shift. Then, after several years, the Red Cross found out, this is a very Belgian story, the Red Cross found out that making volunteers work 12 hours is actually illegal, apparently. It's illegal under European legislation. So they had to make us work a maximum of 8 hours. And so then what I'd do is start my shift at 11 p.m. and then work until 7 a.m. And you get all sorts of amazing and varied things. The whole range of human experience was something which was open to you as a paramedic. You'd have shootouts. We covered, I forgot to tell you, I was based in the hospital, which is the Hôpital Molière, which is in Saint-Gilles. Saint-Gilles, for those of you who don't know it, is, or was certainly in those days when I started, a very poor and downbeat section of Brussels. It's moving up in the world now. It's become gentrified in recent years. But in those days, Saint-Gilles and Anderlecht and Forêt, those were the three communes that we covered on night shift. And our ambulance was based at the Hôpital Molière in Avenue Molière, and we had a permanent ambulance station within the hospital. So we'd have our meals with the night shift, the doctors and nurses, and we'd be part of the medical team at the hospital. That's 8 minutes. Do you want me to carry on? I can carry on for as long as you like.
8 stop.
8 stop. Okay, I've got to stop apparently. The next section of my talk will be about cardiac defibrillation.